I'm Professor Peloso, strategy guru and creator of Strategy in Action. For years I've been fascinated by this piece of work called The Strength of Weak Ties, and I've included it many times in the kind of work that I do with individuals, teams and organizations in their pursuit of success. Recently, I've been fascinated increasingly by how we can use this. And here are a couple of pieces about what the author actually meant when he was talking about these weak ties and also obviously strong ties. So he talks about strong ties being those that exist between members with frequent interactions, such as family and close friends. And to me, in a professional environment, these also include those that we work with on a very regular basis. We might call them our besties at work, the people that we work with really closely. In my kind of work, they're often my co-presenters, some of these amazing people that I work directly with, also researchers. And in many times, I also build strong bonds with clients, for example, who want to continue the kind of work that they're doing with me. Now, weak ties are those that are more distant social relationships, infrequent interactions, and often acquaintances, and in many times strangers. And this is important because the overall premise is that often we find great ideas about where our innovations come from, those interesting things that just pop into things that we mightn't necessarily always think about, just new ideas and new thoughts that come from interactions, something we might read, something that we're chatting to somebody. Interestingly, we'll often be on an aeroplane or an airport or at a conference, and we just have these unexpected conversations. What's increasingly important, though, is that are these weak ties. So these are friends of friends of friends, or colleagues of colleagues of colleagues. In fact, the author actually talks about those that might be 7 or 8 steps removed, who we sometimes get the most useful ideas, because these are not often the ideas that we might come into contact because of those we work with closely. The old adage is that birds of a feather flock together. That's how marketing in many ways works. That's how organizations work. So those we're closer to, often we have similar ideas, or we can actually debate ideas. Something that has popped into my mind, and I think is really important, and one of the premises of this, of why it works and doesn't work. Sometimes you might have an offer from an organization that you're doing business with, and it says recommend a family or friend. Typically that's asking you to reach out to someone you're close to. We call these strong ties. We call these bridging ties, direct ties. Now, I think it's far less likely that we'd be suggesting a family or friend for an offer from which we're getting benefit. They might get some benefit, but we might get some immediate something in return. And it feels a little bit not quite right. Perhaps if they encouraged us to reach out to those weak ties. Just a thought anyway. So let's dig a little bit more deeply. I like to think of the whole process in terms of, maybe you call them stakeholders, maybe you call it networks. I like to think of it as ties. If we say ties, this infers people. This is about the people that we're in those weak or strong social and or professional relationships with. I use this kind of visual a lot because it reminds us that we can have direct relationships, we can have indirect relationships, those around us have relationships with each other or not. And they're often this thing of shadows, so sometimes there are negative connotations, there's other stuff going on. So it always reminds me about how complex this concept of networks, or as I prefer to call it, our link of ties, or a stakeholder landscape, for example, when we think about this. So let's continue here. So a couple of things that I think are really important, and to be honest, at some point you might want to drop out of this video because I then do start to get into more technical things. However, here are a few things that I'd like you to take away, if you would, particularly when you're working on that milestone project of yours. So Think of ties rather than networks. It makes it personal. Think of people rather than structures. We look at organizational structures, but ultimately that's really about humans and people going about doing things. Or technology that's driven by people. And I like the idea of, we get these great ideas from around us, distant things, things we read, things that we hear people say, a friend of a friend of a friend, or a colleague or a colleague or a colleague has said. So let's think of this as about sharing, learning and growing. The amazing and famous Professor Bob Cialdini, or Robert Cialdini, amongst his 6 principles, one of them is the principles of reciprocity. You give something to someone and you get something in return. I like to think of reciprocity in many ways as one way. Think of it as giving, that we're sharing without any expectation of something in return. And in that way, who knows what we're going to get in return, and who knows what someone else might receive from us in the way that we go about working. Now so recently this has become even more important, both practically, and also re-sparked my interest in the strength of weak ties. So a Nobel Prize in economics was just awarded. This is 2025. The 3 folks who are involved in this were very interested in innovation and how older societies, ancient societies, why they grew, and in some cases why they actually failed. So they're really thinking about innovation and that economic growth. And they were specifically focused on the last 2 centuries. And here are a couple of takeaways from this. So they were really thinking about where technological progress comes from and how that helps. So that was the big picture question that they had. And this is one of their key takeouts, key findings. When civilizations were open to influences, whatever they were, wherever they came from, and when they let people experiment with new ideas and innovations, they prospered.